My name is Danielle Monroe, but everyone calls me Dani. I'm 28 years old, and I work as a radiology tech in the emergency department at Redwood Memorial Hospital in Eureka, California. Most people pass through an ER without ever realizing someone like me is here. They see the nurses rushing between beds, the doctors snapping orders, the paramedics wheeling in stretchers, and they think that's the whole story. But the truth is, part of that story is written behind glass, in darkened rooms where glowing monitors reveal what the human body is hiding. That's where I live. That's my world. I'm the one who tells the patient to hold still, to hold their breath, while the machine circles them like an enormous white eye. I'm the one who sees the first evidence of catastrophe, a bleed blooming inside the skull, a tumor threaded through the lungs, a fracture slicing deep into marrow. I've built my life on the quiet conviction that images don't lie, that if you know how to read them, you can find truth hidden where the body refuses to speak. But one night, not long ago, a scan showed me something that didn't belong in any anatomy chart, something I couldn't classify or explain. And that one scan shattered everything I thought I believed. The roots of that night go back much further, to Denver, where I grew up. My father's cancer was my first education in radiology. I was just a teenager when his diagnosis arrived like a hammer in the middle of our lives. Suddenly, the rhythm of our house changed. No more family dinners. No more weekends at the park. Instead, everything was appointments, lab results, and films. He'd come home with thick manila envelopes stuffed with scans, and I'd sit beside him as he pulled them out, the black and white sheets glowing when held against a lamp. He didn't try to protect me from what they showed. He'd trace lines with his finger, showing me where the shadows were, what the doctor said they meant. "See this?" He'd whisper, his finger steady despite his trembling hand. "This is the liver. And this is what doesn't belong." I didn't understand everything then, but I understood enough to know those images were telling the truth my parents' voices could not. I understood that scans were more than pictures. They were maps of fate. And I understood the helplessness of watching shadows grow darker, week after week, until the man who had taught me everything about life disappeared into the silence of a hospital bed. After he died, Denver felt unbearable. My mother was lost in her grief, and my siblings looked at me like I had abandoned them when I said I wanted to leave. Maybe they were right. I told myself I was chasing a career, that I was honoring my father by studying radiology, that I was turning tragedy into purpose. But the truth was simpler. I was running. I wanted a place where every hallway didn't smell of disinfectant and chemo, where every corner didn't remind me of the man who was gone. That's how I ended up in Eureka. A place where the redwoods tower like cathedrals, where the Pacific pounds the cliffs like a heartbeat. Redwood Memorial promised me steady work, endless cases, and the anonymity of being just another face in a hospital. But it also gave me something else, the chance to stand at the threshold between what can be explained and what cannot. People think radiology is detached, cold. They imagine me pushing buttons while the real medicine happens on the other side of the doors. They don't understand that sometimes I'm the first to know a life has changed. That moment when the image sharpens and the truth appears, that belongs to me. I see the bleed before the neurosurgeon does. I see the tumor before the oncologist does. I see the fracture before the orthopedic surgeon even arrives. Every pixel carries a weight. Every line and blur tells me something about whether a person walks out of here or never leaves. And yet, despite all that, I told myself I was safe. Safe behind the glass, safe with the hum of the machines, safe in the belief that shadows had limits, that no matter how bad they were, they belonged to biology. Until that one night, when the scan gave me something else entirely. It was a Tuesday night in late autumn. The fog had rolled in thick from the Pacific, swallowing the town. By the time I pulled into the hospital lot, the lamps were only glowing orbs in a white blur, and the damp air soaked through my jacket. I remember thinking how muffled everything felt, like the world had been wrapped in cotton. Inside, the ER had its usual rhythm, the rattle of stretchers, the low voices of nurses exchanging reports, the steady chirp of heart monitors. I felt a strange comfort in it all. Routine meant control. Routine meant I could bury myself in the work and not think about anything else. My suite was waiting, cold and humming, the scanner sitting in the middle like some pale altar. I checked calibration, ran the startup sequence, reviewed the list of scheduled patients. A broken ankle, a suspected pneumonia, an elderly woman with a head injury. Nothing unusual. I told myself it would be a long night, but not a haunting one. But then, around 9:30, I heard the sound that never fails to change the air in the hospital. The crash doors slammed open. Paramedics' voices rose above the hum, urgent, clipped, controlled. A stretcher rattled across the floor. Male, mid-30s, unresponsive at the scene. Found on a back road outside town, no ID, no obvious injuries. That was all I caught as they flew past. And then the intercom lit up. Radiology, trauma, CT, stat. My heart gave that familiar jolt. Half adrenaline, half dread. No matter how many times I'd heard it, the words still carried weight. I moved quickly. Contrast prepped, table cleared, calibration checked again, even though I'd already done it. A ritual, part superstition, part control. I told myself it would be like any other trauma. A body hiding injuries, waiting for me to translate them into answers. I had no way of knowing that when the images began to appear on my monitor, they would show me something that didn't belong to medicine at all. Something that would stay with me long after the man on the table took his last breath. Because that night, I didn't just see inside his body. I saw something pressing to get out. I had been working long enough at Redwood to know that trauma cases arrive like storms, unpredictable, violent, and quick to consume everything around them. The paramedics rolled him in fast, monitors trailing wires like tangled roots. He was pale, slick with sweat, a mask fogging faintly over his mouth and nose. His hair was dark, matted to his forehead, and his chest rose with the shallow insistence of someone clinging to a rope that was already slipping from their hands. The nurses flanked him with efficient precision, one adjusting IV lines, another reading vitals in a calm voice that tried to mask the danger underneath. His blood pressure was low, his heart rate erratic. Oxygen saturation, dipping into numbers we don't like to say out loud. And yet, for all that instability, there were no visible wounds, no broken bones protruding, no obvious bleeding. He looked like a man who had simply been erased from consciousness by something invisible. Unresponsive at the scene, the paramedic repeated for the attending physician, who leaned over the stretcher with a frown. No trauma evident. Found alone. We don't know how long he was down. That made him mine. The ER needed answers, and answers often begin with the machine. CT, head, chest, abdomen. Stat. The attending barked, and I was already moving, already clearing the room, already preparing the scanner like muscle memory. We transferred him carefully onto the table. His weight sagged in our arms, the kind of limp heaviness that always makes my stomach turn, because living bodies resist gravity, even when they're unconscious. This man did not resist. He lay as though he had been handed over to us already defeated. I strapped him in, positioned his chin, secured his arms. The table hummed beneath him, ready to slide into the bore. I tried not to notice how cold his skin felt when my fingers brushed his wrist, adjusting the line. I told myself it was shock, just shock. The resident on call hovered close, her penlight still in her hand. Still no pupillary response, she muttered, more to herself than to me. Could be hypoxia, could be neuro. She looked at me then, a quick flick of her eyes, like she was waiting for me to tell her the machine would provide clarity. That's what people always think, that the scanner is a crystal ball, that once the slices populate on the monitor, the truth will simply appear. What they don't understand is that sometimes the truth doesn't want to be found. I began the sequence. The gantry whirred. The table shifted. The patient's body slid into the white ring, swallowed whole by the machine. On my side of the glass, the console lit up, slices blooming one by one, each a cross-section of the man who lay inside. The head first. Bone window. Clean skull, no fractures. Brain window. Ventricles symmetrical. No midline shift. No bleed. For a moment, relief flickered. No massive stroke. No catastrophic bleed. We moved down. Chest. Contrast running smoothly through the IV, pumping into vessels, making the structures glow on the screen. Lung windows opened, black fields stippled with the branching trees of airways. I expected to see something ordinary. A contusion. A rib fracture. A collapsed lobe. Something I could name. Something the textbooks had trained me to identify. But what I saw wasn't ordinary. It wasn't even medical. At first it looked like artifact, static noise, a blur from motion. But when I zoomed, adjusted window and level, it resolved. Pale lines, symmetrical. 5 of them. Pressed against the inside of his right lung, fanning outward like fingers. My breath caught. Artifact, I muttered to myself, too quickly. The resident leaned over my shoulder. What is that? I didn't answer. I recentered, ran the chess sequence again. The table slid him back through, the gantry thrumming. A second set of slices populated. The shape remained, clearer now, not blur, not noise. A hand, pressing from inside his chest cavity, splayed as if against glass. The room grew colder. The hum of the scanner seemed to falter, quieter, hesitant. I realized my own hands were shaking on the keyboard. The patient shifted suddenly. His head jerked against the cradle, lips moving beneath the oxygen mask. The nurse bent down, ear close. "What did you say?" she whispered. But the man only rattled out a breath, shallow and wet, before slipping back into silence. The resident swallowed. "Dani," she whispered, voice tight. "Run it again." I did, and again, the same impossible image appeared, like something trapped in the lungs was pressing outward, desperate to be free. We paged the attending. He stormed in with irritation already sharpening his words, until he saw the monitor. Then his voice stopped. He stared, jaw set, as if he could will the image to become something else. "Run it again," he ordered. So I did. And once more, there it was. Fingers. Pale, perfect, impossible. No one spoke after that. We just stood there, staring at the screen, as though silence might change what we all saw. The man on the table stirred again, weaker this time. His lips formed shapes under the mask, silent words carried away by failing lungs. His chest rose once more, shallow and rattling, and then fell. The monitor stuttered, alarms spiking into the air. The nurses rushed in, the attending barking orders, the resident pressing at his chest, and I sat frozen, eyes still fixed on the impossible image on my screen. The scan was supposed to explain his injuries. Instead, it left me with a question that has never been answered. The alarms split the air like a siren, shrill and merciless, and in that instant, the illusion of control shattered. I had been staring at the scan, hypnotized by the shape pressing outward from his chest, but now the monitor screamed what the body already knew. He was slipping. The attending lunged forward, hands on the bed rails, barking for compressions. The resident climbed onto the stool at his side, her hands pressing into the man's sternum in a rhythm as old as medicine itself. Each compression jolted his body, straps straining to hold him against the scanner table. The nurse reached for the ambu bag, squeezing air into his lungs with desperate precision. From where I sat behind the glass, it looked like theater, the fluorescent stage, the choreography of medicine. But the sound was all too real. The groan of plastic with each pump, the hiss of air forced into reluctant lungs, the relentless shriek of the flatline monitor. I should have been recalibrating, preparing to rerun, doing something useful. Instead, I sat frozen, my eyes darting between the impossible scan and the body convulsing beneath their hands. "Come on," the attending muttered, sweat breaking on his temple. "Stay with us." The resident counted compressions under her breath, her lips tightening with each number. The nurse's knuckles whitened around the bag valve mask. They worked with the urgency of people who still believed they could win. But I kept seeing the image. Those pale arcs, fingers spread against the lung, like something alive, like something aware. And with each compression, each forced breath, I swore I saw the shape flex, shifting on the monitor though the scan was frozen. I blinked hard, shook my head, told myself fatigue was twisting my senses. Machines hum, eyes deceive, brains invent patterns. That's what training teaches you. But training doesn't prepare you for images that move when they shouldn't. Pulse check, the attending snapped. The nurse pressed fingers to the carotid, shook her head. Nothing. Resume compressions. The resident's shoulders strained, her palms slamming into his chest, the sound echoing like a fist against a door. I realized then that the door I feared wasn't the one they were pounding on. It was the one I had already seen. A door inside his chest, where a hand pressed outward, waiting. Minutes stretched. My heart pounded so loud it seemed to sync with the rhythm of compressions. I kept imagining what I'd do if the handprint on the scan pressed harder. If it began to push through, if it tore open a body not made to hold it. But nothing happened except the inevitable. At 12 minutes, the attending's voice cracked around the words no doctor ever wants to speak. Time of death, 22:01. The resident sagged back on the stool, chest heaving. The nurse let the ambu bag fall to the bed, her face pale with exhaustion. The room seemed to exhale all at once. The alarms quieted, replaced by the dull, endless tone of the flatline. I sat frozen. The attending peeled off his gloves with a snap and turned to me. His face was impassive, professional, as if nothing unusual had happened here. "Print the films," he said. "File them under trauma, respiratory failure due to blunt injury, that's all." I wanted to argue, to ask him if he had seen what I had. But his eyes, cold and weary, warned me against it. They wheeled the man away, down the corridor toward the morgue. The straps still hugged his body. His lips had stilled, his chest had quieted. But the image on my monitor remained, a hand pressed outward, forever caught in grayscale. When the room was finally empty, I stood. My legs trembled beneath me, as though I had run a great distance without moving at all. I crossed into the suite, my hand shaking as I reached for the console. I zoomed in on the chest slices. Again and again. No matter the angle, no matter the window, the shape persisted. Fingers, palm pressing outward like a soul desperate to escape its prison. My throat felt dry, my stomach twisted. Against every protocol, I hit print. The machine whirred, spitting out films that I slid into a manila folder. I tucked it under my arm like contraband. In the hall, voices carried as the staff reset for the next emergency. The ER doesn't pause for grief or mystery. The next patient always comes. But as I stood there, folder pressed tight against my chest, I felt the tremor of something larger. A case that would not fade. An image that would not dissolve. Later that night, when I finally walked outside into the fog, I could still feel it. The press of unseen fingers, not on the screen this time, but in the air around me. Like something that had been trapped in that man's chest had slipped free when his heart stopped, and now it wandered the halls of Redwood, searching. That was the beginning of the haunting. Because once you've seen something like that, you can never return to believing medicine has all the answers. After every death in the ER, there's a rhythm of cleanup. A ritual designed to erase what just happened so the space can be used again. Nurses wipe down surfaces with the sharp bite of antiseptic. Orderlies strip the bed, bundle sheets heavy with sweat and sorrow, and roll them away. Someone updates the board. Someone else files the chart. And by the time the next trauma comes through, you'd never know a life had just ended there. The hospital thrives on that erasure. It has to. If the walls kept every ghost, no one could bear to work inside them. But I couldn't erase what I'd seen. The rest of the night blurred into routine. An ankle fracture, a pneumonia follow-up, a pediatric scan for a child who'd swallowed a coin. Cases I should have focused on, cases that needed my precision. But every time I turned back to the console, the monitor betrayed me. My hands adjusted contrast, toggled window levels, measured densities, yet all I saw were those pale arcs in his chest, the spread of fingers pressed outward like something alive. I kept the folder under my station desk, my eyes flicking toward it between patients, as if it were burning a hole through the floor. Every time the printer whirred for another case, I expected the films to slip free where someone else could see them. Every time a nurse stopped by to ask about a scan, I shifted in my chair, terrified they would notice how stiffly I was sitting, how tightly I guarded my workspace. No one mentioned the man again. Not the resident, not the attending, not the nurses who'd worked themselves to exhaustion trying to save him. His case was filed away under the same flat words that bury countless others. Respiratory failure, trauma, unknown cause. That was the official story. And it struck me with a kind of dread that official stories don't have to be true. They only have to be tidy. I told myself I should let it go. Burn the films. Pretend it was Artifact. But Artifact doesn't haunt you in the hallways. Artifact doesn't whisper in your mind when you close your eyes. The first ripple came the next morning, when I sat alone in the staff break room with a mug of coffee gone cold. A nurse from night shift wandered in, yawning, her scrubs wrinkled. She leaned against the counter and sighed. "Strange case last night," she said, almost absent-mindedly. "That John Doe. No trauma, nothing obvious, just gone." I forced myself to nod, keeping my face neutral. "Yeah," I said. "Strange." Her eyes lingered on me a moment, as though she sensed something in my voice. Then she shrugged and poured herself coffee, stirring in powdered creamer that floated like ash on the surface. "ER eats the strange ones," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "Best not to think too much about them." I wanted to ask if she had seen anything. Any hint of recognition when she bent close to hear his last words. Any flicker of fear when the monitor screamed. But the words died in my throat. Because what if she hadn't? What if it had only been me? That doubt was its own kind of infection. It spread quickly. In the days that followed, I found myself lingering over every scan. I stared at lungs, at vessels, at the delicate shadows of bone and muscle, searching for patterns that didn't belong. My colleagues teased me for how long I spent at the console, calling me a perfectionist. I smiled tightly and said nothing, but the truth was, I wasn't looking for disease anymore. I was looking for hands. At night, when I tried to sleep in my small apartment with the ocean fog pressing against the windows, I heard echoes of the ER. The hiss of oxygen. The shriek of alarms. The sound of straps creaking as compressions drove his body into the table. And beneath it all, I swore I could hear something else. A faint scraping, like fingers pressing against glass. I stopped visiting my mother's calls as often. Every time she rang, her voice carried the weight of Denver, of grief I had abandoned. I used to feel guilty for leaving her. Now I was terrified she'd hear something in my voice. Some fracture I couldn't explain. What would I tell her? That the machines I trusted had betrayed me? That I no longer believed shadows were only anatomy? The hospital itself began to feel different. Redwood Memorial was always a place of noise and light, but now its silences were louder. I noticed the moments between traumas, when the halls went still and the fluorescent lights hummed alone. I noticed the way fog slipped through the ambulance bay doors, curling into corners like breath. I noticed how patients sometimes stared past me, their eyes fixed on something unseen. One night, while escorting an elderly woman back from a scan, she gripped my hand with surprising strength. Her eyes were cloudy with age, but sharp with fear. "There's someone standing behind you," she whispered. I froze, my heart jolting. I turned, slowly. The hall was empty, only the gurney wheels squeaked against the tile. When I looked back at her, she had already closed her eyes, drifting into the half-sleep of exhaustion. I told myself she was confused, delirious, her words meaningless. But the truth was, I didn't believe myself. Not anymore. I kept the folder hidden. Sometimes, after my shift, I would take it out in my apartment, lay the films across the kitchen table, and stare at them until my vision blurred. No matter how long I studied, the image never changed. Fingers, palm, pressing outward. Sometimes I traced them with my own hand, palm against plastic, fingertip against fingertip. And in those moments, I could almost feel pressure pushing back. I thought about showing someone, the resident, maybe, the one who had whispered beside me that night. But then I imagined her face tightening with pity, Imagined her whispering to colleagues that Dani Monroe was unraveling, that she couldn't handle the night shift anymore. I imagined being told to take leave, to get help, and I knew I couldn't risk it. The ER feeds on competence, and once you're seen as fragile, you're finished. So I carried it alone. The ripples spread further. Small things at first. A pen light left on the counter when I knew I had put it away. A contrast syringe rolling across the floor, though the room was empty. Once the scanner hummed to life with no patient inside, the table sliding forward into the bore, as if summoned by invisible weight. I stood frozen in the control room, watching it move. The console showed no command, no input. Just the machine, whirring, as though replaying the memory of a body that was no longer here. When it stopped, the silence pressed against my ears until I thought I'd scream. That was when I understood. The case wasn't over. It hadn't ended with time of death. It hadn't ended with tidy words in a report. Whatever had pressed outward on that scan, it was still pressing. Through the hospital. Through me. And I began to wonder if the scan had not only changed what I believed about medicine, but about the boundaries between what we see and what we refuse to see. Because once the ripple starts, it never truly stops. I used to think the hardest part of working in radiology was the loneliness. You sit behind glass, hours on end, staring at a glow only you can interpret. You see the hidden catastrophes before anyone else, but you can't touch the patients, can't save them with your own hands. You're the messenger of shadows, nothing more. I thought that was the burden I'd carry all my life. But after that night, after the man with no name, I learned there are heavier burdens than solitude. The folder never left my possession. I kept it hidden in my apartment, away from the hospital, as though distance could blunt its power. Sometimes I would force myself to leave it tucked away for days, pretending I could forget. But inevitably I'd find myself pulling it out, sliding the films across my kitchen table, and staring again into the grainy grayscale of his chest. Always the same. The palm, the fingers, pressed outward as though the body itself had become a cage. I tried to reason with myself, to say it was artifact, a trick of the machine, a coincidence of density and shadow. I told myself all the things training had drilled into me. Repeat the scan, check the settings, never trust a single image. But no amount of rationalizing could explain the persistence of that shape, the symmetry of it, the way it seemed almost aware. At the hospital, I kept working. Cases came and went. A child with a fractured skull from a fall. A fisherman crushed between logs. A young mother with a tumor that lit up like a starburst across her abdomen. I scanned them all, printed their films, handed off results. On the surface, nothing changed. But inside me, everything had shifted. I no longer trusted the images to stay within the realm of anatomy. I no longer trusted the world to confine itself to what could be named. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would hear the hum of the scanner in my apartment, though I lived miles from the hospital. I would wake to the sound of its motor whirring, the faint mechanical churn of the gantry, as though the machine had followed me home. I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, holding my breath, listening for footsteps that never came. One night, walking through the ER corridor after a long shift, I passed the room where he had died. The lights were low, the bed stripped and remade, waiting for the next emergency. But as I moved past, I froze. On the glass of the scanner control window, I saw it. A faint condensation mark, like the print of a hand, pressed against the inside. I reached out instinctively, touching the cold surface. My fingers aligned perfectly with the shape. By the time I blinked, it was gone. I dreamed of the patient's face, pale and slick, his lips moving beneath the oxygen mask. In the dream, I could finally hear what he was saying. But it wasn't words I recognized. It was the sound of air rushing through lungs that weren't his own. The sound of something trying to breathe for the first time. I'd wake gasping, clutching my chest, sure I'd feel the press of a hand from within. I started to avoid looking too long at any scan, afraid I'd see something else pressing through, afraid I'd find more than anatomy waiting. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. Every time the images populated on the screen, I leaned closer, searching for shapes in the grain, terrified and desperate in equal measure. I used to believe radiology was the purest form of truth in medicine. That images didn't lie, that what we saw was reality laid bare. But now I know images can reveal things we aren't meant to see. Things that unravel the fragile scaffolding of belief we build around ourselves. I think often about my father. About those nights in Denver when he'd trace the shadows on his own scans and explain what was killing him with the patience of a teacher. He believed in the science. He believed the images held answers. I wonder what he would say if he saw what I saw. If he'd tell me to dismiss it, to cling to reason. Or if, deep down, he'd recognize it too. The possibility that something else lingers in the spaces between bone and breath. It's been months since that night, but the case hasn't left me. I still feel it when I walk through the halls of Redwood. I still see his face in my dreams. I still keep the folder hidden, though sometimes I think about burning it, destroying the evidence. But I never do. Because some part of me knows, the image is burned deeper than film. It's etched into me now. I tell myself I will keep working. That I will keep scanning bodies and reading shadows and pretending that everything I see belongs to the realm of science. But late at night, when the hospital is quiet, when the fog presses against the windows and the hum of the machines feels too loud, I know the truth. The case will always be the moment I stopped believing medicine had all the answers and started fearing the things it cannot see.